beekeeping for years at ATI here on the Worcester campus. So possibly many of our participants today have had Dr. Headings.
Yes, good day everybody, and thank you for logging into this webinar. I welcome your participation. My name is Mark Headings, and I'll be speaking about skunk behavior in the bee yard. You'll see here I have a table of contents of the various points I want to discuss with you today. An introduction followed by some classification information, life cycle of the skunk, diet of the skunk, skunk behavior, predators of skunks, examples of bee sting behavior, observation of skunk feeding activity in my apiary, and evidence of skunks in the apiary, and finally resolving skunk problems. So we'll take these one by one and discuss them as we go along. So as an introduction, let me say that I've been a beekeeper for many years and have given presentations and taught courses and have written and published articles on the subject of beekeeping. I became a beekeeper in the spring of 1979 and have continued the craft ever since. After doing some planning, my journey with the bees began by driving my small Datsun car south to Jessup, Georgia, loading it up with 15 3-pound packages of bees, and these were Starline queens. Most beekeepers would not start with 15, probably with 1 or 2, but that was the way I decided to begin. And so I turned right around, came home, and when I arrived there, I had 15 new white hive boxes that were lined up in a straight row and all ready to go behind my house. So I filled them with the bees, and of course at that time I knew very little about beekeeping, but that is how my life as a beekeeper began. Well, needless to say, over the years I've been exposed to a lot of information and experiences since the time this journey began, like 34 years ago. In terms of skunk classification, the skunk is a member of the weasel family, and there are 4 common types of skunks in the USA, which are the striped, the spotted, the hog-nosed, and the hooded. And the striped skunk is really widely spread across the USA and is the one that I found visiting my beehives. The scientific name of it, of course, is Mephitis mephitis. And I want to proceed with the life cycle of the skunk, which would produce 1 litter per year, which generally consists of 48 kittens. And the breeding begins in about mid-February to the end of March. That's about the span of the breeding season. Probably the latter part of February is when much of the breeding occurs. And then the gestation for the developing young is 2 months. And so that is quite a short gestation period when you think about it. And then in terms of skunk diet, the skunks eat a variety of foods. I'm going to show you here a couple of those. They are omnivorous. Their primary food during the spring and summer is primarily of insects and small mammals. And then during the autumn and winter, they start eating more and more of the plant materials. But for skunks, they are the primary predator of honeybees in North America, and so it is a very significant animal for us to become more familiar with. You'll see here I'm showing you some honeybees and also a crayfish. These would be, of course, the 2 items in their diet. And likewise, beetles. I love to eat beetles, and bird eggs, and probably even young birds as well. And some additional types of creatures we could talk about would be the grasshoppers and crickets, moth larvae, earthworms, fish, frogs, mice, rats, shrews and moles, young rabbits, birds, especially young ones. And of course, you talk about plant material like corn and nuts and certain berries and cherries and so on. So these are some of the foods that they would typically feed upon. And then I wanted to move on talking a bit about skunk behavior. They are what is referred to as crepuscular, which means that they are active during dawn and dusk. Now, quite often you'll see it written that skunks are nocturnal, which is not quite precisely correct because it's not in the middle of the night when they're doing their work. It's like in the dusk or dawn periods of the day. And in fact, my experience was seeing the skunks in the dusk towards evening. And so the skunk you see here in the photo was one that I photographed. And I'll be telling you a story about that in just a little bit. But the skunk does not seem to actually hibernate during the winter as, let's say, a bear would. But it does go into a period of inactivity for at least several weeks or so in the middle of the winter when it's very cold. They remain in their den. Now there may be occasions when it's a very bright moonlit night or a very dark cloudy day that you might see them out and about, but primarily dawn and dusk. Skunks acquire the ability to release a musk called mercaptan, which they use as a means of defense, at quite a young age. In fact, I remember an experience when I was in my youth. I recall running to try to catch a small baby skunk. I saw a big mother with 4 little ones behind, and they were trailing quite a ways behind, so I thought I could probably pick up the last one. And as I stooped down to do it, I got the full effect of the spray. The little skunk simply tipped up on its front end. In other words, its tail was sticking up in the air, the back end of the skunk, and it simply left the spray fly. Skunks can spray quite a ways. In fact, probably at least 10 feet, maybe even 12 or 15 feet. So that's a pretty good distance for a skunk to be able to deliver its mercaptan. And then I want to say a word also about predators of skunks. Some of the reported examples are the great horned owls, and from my reading, this is probably one of the most important predators of skunks. Apparently they do not smell very they don't have a sense of smell to speak of, as is true with probably many birds. And so the odor is not the deterrent for this kind of a bird. And then other birds like eagles, and you'll see I have some bald eagles shown here. The eagles on the left there are the juveniles, and the right you see the white-capped adult. I didn't realize until fairly recently that the adults have the white head, and that the young doesn't turn white for maybe a year or two or whatever the period is. But you'll see they have a pretty distinctive mouth on them in terms of being able to feed on prey. Also, there are coyotes and foxes, which it's thought they may not actually feed on skunks very much because they really just like the odor that is produced from the skunk. But perhaps at times they would do that. Bobcats and badgers and a few other things that would actually be predators of skunks. In terms of, well, let me just show you the next slide first. I found this dead skunk in my bee yard, and that's my bee yard in the background. And so it died right here at the edge of the yard. I found it on December 19. And of course I didn't know what might have killed the skunk. It was partially eaten, and of course the skin has been stripped off. But it could have been one of the predators that I just described a moment ago. But this is the same bee yard in which earlier in June, which I'll be telling you about, is where I see the skunks visiting my colonies. And then I wanted to talk a bit about the bee sting behavior. I recall years ago, an old-time beekeeper here in Worcester used to tell about speaking to students in elementary schools about beekeeping. And he mentioned that students would often ask, do you get stung when you work with bees? And he says, well, do you get wet when you go swimming? And he'd say, of course, I get stung. But I think, the question arises, how many stings can one tolerate? And when you look at other animals, particularly, would they experience the same kind of effect that a human would? I think as beekeepers, we all know what bee stings feel like. But I want to relate a story which happened to me many years ago. It was probably 2 or 3 years after I began beekeeping in 1979. I had a big long string of bees, as I said, laid out there behind my house, and I noticed that the hive at one end had gotten quite aggressive, and it had was getting quite strong, and I thought maybe I should be splitting this colony, particularly since it was so aggressive. I think out of spite, perhaps, I thought this would be a good thing to do. But anyway, at that same time, my children had some chickens. I had a flock of chickens close to that area, and so maybe 100 feet or so from the nearest hive. Well, anyway, I went about splitting the colony. In fact, I even split it twice, and things went well. The bees were very angry at me, and of course a lot of them were flying around, but I was well protected. And so after near the end of that day, I mentioned to my young daughter, I said, why don't we go catch the chickens and put them in some cages that we had acquired earlier for them. And so as we walked down there to that fenced-in area where they were, I was really shocked to see the condition of that small flock of chickens. Several chickens were dead. Several more appeared to be what I'll call half dead. They were sort of, their heads were hanging over. And several more were alive and well. And furthermore, when the bees came down there, they apparently frightened the chickens. They had aborted their eggs, and so we had a number of soft-shelled eggs were scattered around on the ground. As I went into the pen to more closely inspect the chickens, particularly the ones that were half dead, I noticed their heads were full of bee stings, and apparently the unhappy bees in the colony I had split earlier in the day flew down to the chicken pen and took out their anger on the helpless chickens. So I took those that were half dead, so to speak, to my garage where I sat down with the tweezers in hand and commenced to pull out the stingers one by one, of course knowing full well that the stingers had already done their work. But I think there was a feeling of satisfaction in my removing them anyway. Stings were all over the head, including the comb, the eyelids, and every space you could that wasn't covered by feathers. And of course, where the feathers occurred on the bird, that was pretty well protected, it appeared. But I think, as I recall, I removed probably approximately 30 stings per head from a chicken. And then I thought, well, I know what I would do if I was getting stung. I'd go take some Benadryl. And since we had some on hand, I thought, well, let's give these chickens Benadryl to see whether that would either hasten their death or revive them. In any case, I gave it to each of the several chickens that were in that condition, and within probably a week or so, they all recovered and began to lay eggs again. In hindsight, I was so stunned by the entire episode that I did not even think about taking any photos of what had just happened. So I remember, I was the instigator in this case, and the chickens were the recipients of my activity in the apiary. I'd like to now return to the next story about, this one's a personal story. And in this case, of course, I was both the investigator and the recipient. As a beekeeper, you think that with time you kind of gain some experience and some wisdom. But even as an experienced beekeeper, I made a foolish mistake. I was removing honey from colonies in the fall of the year, and that part of the job went well. I then commenced to insert apistand strips in the brood chambers for mite control, which, by the way, is a technique that I don't practice anymore. But in any case, as I went down into the brood chambers to put in the strips, the bees became more irritated and were flying around my head quite a lot. And I soon found out that a bee had found its way inside of my veil. And so, as you might have experienced or can imagine, it's very difficult to concentrate on the task at hand with a bee crawling around inside of your veil. So I walked into an alfalfa field that was nearby and decided to remove my veil and toss it in one direction, and I would go the opposite direction. And I guess I had thought that in some cases when I do that, the bees would kind of go with my hat and veil. But the problem in this case was they didn't, and there were quite a few bees still flying above my head. So when I removed the veil, my head was exposed to the bees, and I soon realized that I was getting stung in my head. And by the way, I didn't have much hair by that time, and still have less now, so the bees had a great opportunity. I didn't think I would probably be able to outrun them in a tall alfalfa field, and so I commenced to rub my hands over my head and crush them as they landed. After the attack subsided, I noticed that my toes began to tingle. That was the first time I experienced that feeling following a bee stinging episode. So I decided maybe it's time I should go home and see what's happening here. I got in my pickup truck, and which was this apiary was a different location than my home. So I drove home, and when I got there, I explained to my wife that I'd been stung a number of times in my head. And then I took my dose of Benadryl. After sitting around for about an hour, I felt fine once again. And two of the things to note here is that, of course, my body weight was much greater than that of a chicken, and a chicken is not a mammal either. So I don't know if we can make any comparisons there. But I wanted to follow up with now telling a story about the skunk. This was something, too, that was a brand new experience for me. The pictures I'm going to be showing you here were taken in my apiary at dusk about 8 o'clock, 8 to 8:15 on June 27, 2012. Skunks appear to really enjoy eating honey. And apparently it tolerates stings quite well. In this case, skunks are both the instigators and the recipients of bee stings. I've read about skunks eating honeybees, I should say, and I've also routinely seen evidence of their presence in my bee yards during the past 34 years. I think I didn't fully realize the extent of damage they were doing to my bees at that time or over the years. However, I'd never caught a skunk in the act of doing it, and that's what kind of amazed me. It was very common each year to see a hive or two where you could see with distinct evidence that skunks had been working on that hive, but I could never catch them at it. And so not until after 33 years, which was a year ago, in late June of last year, what happened was on June 26, my wife and I got in our pickup truck and drove to a field where our bee yard was located. It's mostly surrounded by goldenrod, tall grass, trees, briars, and other foliage, which incidentally provides some really good cover from wild animals, including skunks. And so anyway, we'd gone out there for a short period, I think maybe to give the bees some more water or something like that. And so as I was preparing to leave to start the engine, before I started, I saw a skunk enter the bee yard through the tall grass at the edge of the yard. And so we just sat quietly in our pickup watching the skunk's behavior. And we were sitting at a vantage point where we could see really quite well in fairly close range. Skunks apparently had pretty poor vision, and so that's to your advantage in that case. Although if you were out walking around, the skunk probably would not appear in the first place. The hives in the bee yard were arranged in 2 rows, and the skunk began at one end of a row and checked the ground in front of the hives, looking for apparently dead bees. And that's really what surprised me, because I didn't think they would be searching so much for dead bees, nor did I think they would be spending so much time checking just about every hive. But of course also trying to capture live ones flying around. As a skunk went down to the end of that row, checking one by one, it then moved over to the next row, the end hive, and then started moving its way hive by hive up towards where we were sitting in the pickup truck. As I sat there, I was just thinking to myself, I've been waiting all these many years to see a skunk in the bee yard, and here I'm witnessing this event for the first time. I don't even have a camera to photograph what's happening. And I was really thinking badly about that, and I thought, maybe if I could sneak out of this vehicle, I could run home and get my camera, and maybe the skunk would still be here. So I explained to my wife I was going to try and do that, and she continued to watch the skunk. I slipped out of the pickup, apparently unnoticed, and I ran to get the camera. But when I got back, the skunk had finished the feasting and disappeared into the surrounding foliage. And needless to say, I was extremely disappointed. But as I sat there and thought a bit more, I thought, well, since the skunk appeared in the bee yard at dusk, about 8 p.m., as the sun was setting, maybe if I came back the next evening at the same time, I could see the skunk again and be prepared. So next day, we returned to the same spot, I'd say at about 7:45 in the evening, and sure enough, the skunk appeared again, probably within 5 minutes plus or minus of the time it appeared the previous day. Of course, this time I was armed with a camera, and I photographed the entire event. The skunk engaged in the same routine. It began as the night before. It began on the hive end of one row, worked its way down to the other end. Some hives spending more time than others, then crossing over to the other end hive on the second row, working its way back towards us sitting in the pickup truck. And one of the things I noticed that was something different was that the skunk was also placing its feet on 2 or 3 of the hives, placing them up on the side of the hive so it could reach the bottom board. And you'll notice that in these hives, I had put the bottom board one super up above where you might normally put it down here on the hive stand. I just simply wanted to get the hive, or get the bottom board up there off the ground further, so I had already done that. But in spite of that, you'll see the skunk, in this case on the left, staring at the bees there on the landing platform of the bottom board, and then the next picture you'll see it with his feet on the hive, nose right up there to the bottom board. And so obviously this was not going to be high enough to deter the skunk. In fact, this distance I measured is about 16 and a half inches from the ground, and it was still able to reach it. Now remember, this bottom hive box is just empty. There are no bees in there. I'm just using that to raise the hive up higher. And so the apiary was in check the next day, the third time, and that night we didn't see the skunk appear. Now maybe it came earlier or later, but we didn't see it. And so we came again then on the 29th, the fourth night, and here the skunk appeared again. But for whatever reason, it did not make its normal routine visiting each hive. It more or less wandered around through the hives a bit and then disappeared once again. Okay, and of course in the slide I'm showing you here, you'll see a view that the skunk might be looking at. If you were to look at the bees here on the landing platform, probably appearing to be a pretty delicious meal there. Let me just say a word before I continue with this, what I have on the slide. It appears to me, if you got a skunk problem in an apiary, several key factors in being able to see the animals, and of course I didn't know this all these years, is first of all, make yourself unseen. And walking into an apiary, you're probably not going to see the skunks by doing that. But it seems that maybe if you're sitting inside of something, in a vehicle like we were, quietly, they sort of go about their activities and do not notice you there. And as I say, they do have fairly poor vision. Also, you want some good weather conditions on a nice day. Pick a nice day, maybe when it's clear and the sun is setting. And also the time of day, at dawn or dusk. I've not really tried it in the dawn, maybe one time, but that's kind of early for some folks to be out there doing that sort of thing, and I'd rather be doing it in the dusk myself. Back to our stinging topic. It's well known that bears like to also eat honeybees, and at least they eat something there, either the brood or the honey. And of course the question is, how do they eat without getting stung, or do they get stung? And can they tolerate a number of stings or not? I noticed in the bee yard, when I was looking at the skunks, they were making rather quick, jerky movements as they were feeding in front of the certain hives. And so I suspect that may have been due to either trying to catch flying bees or else a reflex of being stung. And I noticed that certain bees or bee colonies they spend more time with, and I think that's why you tend to see a colony or two that is hit hard and it dies out, when in fact perhaps a number of the other colonies were fed on. It just didn't get the attention that one or two did. But in any case, on the bears, and let me just move on here to the next one also. They probably like the brood, the larvae and pupae, as their number one choice, maybe the honey is sort of secondary to that. And you'll notice when bears get into a bee yard, you've probably seen or heard about this, how they break the hives apart and scatter them over the ground. And that is probably because they really have the big interest in the brood. If they wanted to simply feed on the adults, they could probably do as the skunk does and just feed on them at the entrance. And I did want to mention about birds too. There are some birds in the world that do eat some bees. This happens to be a nice little bird that is around here. In fact, I took a photo of this one myself, very close to our apiary here in Worcester, Ohio. It's called the eastern kingbird, and they reportedly eat a lot of insects, including some honeybees, but we really should protect them and actually simply allow them to take a few bees. They are quite aggressive and will chase bigger birds like crows and hawks and eagles and so on. And you may have seen already in the sky a big bird flying along with a small bird behind, flying very close to the tail or back of the bird. And of course what they're doing is to chase the bird away from their territory. Coming back to the skunks again, or the bears. Actually, I want to move on into the skunks. A skunk has rather thick fur. Of course, it is probably pretty well protected in most places, but when you think about it, the nose, the mouth, the eyes, and probably to some extent on the lower side of the body, there will be places where it's exposed, and so the skunk must in fact receive quite a few stings as it goes about its work of eating bees. But when you think about the size of a skunk, which is about the size of a cat, at least the striped skunk is about the size of a cat, the question would be, well, how many stings can a skunk tolerate, particularly if it's actually eating them? I was fortunate enough, I came across a study done at the University of California, Davis, and it was one that was done years ago, published in the Journal of Mammalogy, volume 16, in May of 1935, and it described how skunks were trapped beside university hives that they had set up, and then they inspected those skunks for bee stings. And in one of the specimens, the skunks, they counted 65 stings in the mouth and throat of the skunk. And so 65 stings, that's twice 30. So apparently they do get stung, but it doesn't deter their passion for eating the bees, it seems. Okay, I want to just say a word about evidence of skunks in the bee yard. And just excuse me a second. Hello? Hello? I'm sorry, that was a call for someone else. If you're thinking about what do I check when I'm in the bee yard in terms of evidence, of course, if you see dead or live skunks, then of course you know that's what's out there. Another thing would be to look for scratch marks at the hive entrance. You might also notice, and I've seen this a number of times, where the grass would be matted down on the front, and the grass is scratched, the soil is even dug into sometimes. Another one would be skunk feces. And if you happen to see that laying around in the apiary, that you may notice that they're pretty well filled with honeybees, and sometimes they apparently even regurgitate like a cud, almost like a cud from a cow, that would have bees in it. You might detect a skunk odor, and of course, that doesn't mean that it was in the yard. It was probably somewhere in the vicinity. but that's at least start you thinking. Odor of a skunk is apparently quite can drift quite a ways. In fact, I've read that it probably can move a mile and a half away from the initial site. Another one that's quite obvious is if the bee population seems to have declined rather significantly since the last time you checked that hive, but you don't see many dead bees inside. So it's almost like a colony collapse disorder kind of situation where the bees are gone, but you have less of them there. And then, of course, the bees that remain oftentimes seem to be more aggressive when you go in there to open up the hive as a result of this. And I'm showing you on this slide here, if you look at on the left you have the bottom board you see, and then on the right there's a closer up view of the bottom board. You can see the scratch marks all across the top of that bottom board there. And then I want to also just share with you a bit about some options to deal with skunk problems in the apiary. And first of all is moving the bottom board higher up off the ground. And for example, I now have them 2 supers above the ground. Now those supers are both empty boxes. There's no frames in them. They're just simply to provide height. And you see my measuring stick here, that's about 26 inches. Now I've read that even by some that is suggested you go 3 feet, which would be 36 inches. But at least 26 gets it above the reach of the skunk. Of course, if it's too close down, I worry about that a skunk that would be searching for dead bees below could attract the attention of one of the guard bees, and once the skunk is attacked and the alarm pheromone is released, there could still be more bees coming out to sting the skunk. And so certainly I would go at least 26 inches. Maybe you want to even go higher. There is a challenge when you do this. That means that your honey supers, when you put them on, are going to reach higher and higher up into the sky. And I've had to already take a stepladder with me so I could reach the top. Build a fence around the apiary. This could be a wire mesh fence or an electric fence if you use electric wire that's not very high above the ground, which would be about the height of the skunk. You could also have another wire or 2 above, particularly if you have bears or stray cattle or something else that's walking around to keep things out. Thirdly, provide only an upper entrance. In other words, if you had 2 deep supers full of bees, but you provide the opening near the top as opposed to the bottom, at least that would put the opening up above probably the reach of the bees. I think bees tend to like upper entrances, at least that's been my experience, but I'm not sure if I'd want to do that entirely for long periods of time. It may be a shorter term solution in that case. And then using carpet tacks on the landing board. If you take these strips, some of you probably know the strip that's used around the edge of your room where they attach the carpet to, and that's to tighten it and keep it tight. Well, if you take that strip with the points pointing upward and just tack it to the entrance, that can perhaps discourage the skunk from pawing away at the entrance. And you can make your own, and I have done that already, where I've made my own and just attached them to the entrance. And then taking a piece of wood and pounding many nails through it, maybe 12 by 18 inch board, like a treated plywood or something like that, and put the sharp nails pointing upward, that too may discourage the skunk from spending time below the entrance of your hive or your bottom board. Another one which I've never tried, but poultry netting, if you would take some of that and fold it and then staple it to the front of the hive, that could interfere with the skunk pawing away at the front. So that may be an option. And then also selecting apiary sites that have less suitable habitat for skunks. Sometimes we don't have a real good option, but if you have a good option on that, you might want to consider it. And I want to show you here just a couple photos of that sort of thing. Recently I was traveling through Montana, and this is a fenced-in area here showing the fencing concept. And then here you'll see on the left, in fact that's my apiary as it stands right now, you'll see that there's a lot of tall grass, goldenrod, briars and trees around most of the apiary, except for this one side. So it's an excellent hiding place for wild animals. In fact, the skunk that appeared into my apiary was appearing about right here in this grassy spot, or in the center of the picture on the right. When you look at that opposed to a scene like this, here we have a situation with bees on pallets. This is Central Oregon. But you notice that it's really open for a long ways around here. Probably less cover for wildlife to hide. Plus some say that the pallets actually help to deter skunk activity. I haven't tried that particularly. But in this case on the right also you'll see that there's really not very good hiding places around the hive. So that may help to some extent alleviate a skunk kind of problem. Well, in looking back over what we've just talked about, I hope you've gained a better view here maybe of some of the potential threats of skunks to bees. And I guess I would emphasize again, you could be experiencing more damage from bees than you realize. Some of your colonies may have been visited by the skunk, ate some of the bees, but didn't focus on it often enough to actually cause the hive to die. I should say that on the second row of the hives that I had on the photos earlier, the skunk had spent a lot of time at that end hive on the second row, and in fact a little later in the season that hive withered and died. So I can't say for sure it's from the skunk, but it's a very strong possibility. So thank you for your attention. Denise, you want to take